Hello? My name is Derek, and I'm here to tell you a story about betrayal. But this isn't your average story of broken trust. No, this one gets messy. It's about the kind of betrayal that's so gut-wrenching, you can't just walk away. It's the kind of betrayal that forces you to do something about it. I didn't see it coming. I never thought my wife, Sarah, the mother of our 17-year-old son, Jackson, would do this to us. Our marriage hadn't been perfect. Whose is, really, but we had a good thing going, or so I thought. I never imagined that in a single night, everything I'd built, everything I thought I knew, would come crashing down. It all started one Tuesday evening. I was just wrapping up for the day, packing up my laptop in my home office, when Jackson came in. He looked different, not his usual confident self. He was quieter, almost reserved. At first, I thought he'd had a rough day at school, maybe some spat with a friend, but then I noticed something strange. He wouldn't look me in the eye. That's when I knew something big was going on. "Dad, can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded, pulling out a chair across from him. "Of course, Jackson. What's up?" He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles went white. Then, without preamble, he said, "I caught Mom cheating." I sat there, stunned, as the words sank in. It felt like someone had pulled the floor out from under me. Sarah? My wife? My brain tried to reject it, but Jackson's eyes were filled with a grim certainty that was undeniable. "Wait, what do you mean?" I finally managed, though the question sounded hollow in my own ears. I didn't want to hear the answer, but I had to know. Jackson's expression hardened. "I mean exactly what I said, Dad. I caught her. After school, with Mr. Raymond." Mr. Raymond? That name brought a flash of recognition and anger. He was one of Jackson's teachers, the charming, younger guy all the kids loved. My heart started to pound, each beat louder than the last. "You're sure it was them? You're absolutely sure?" I asked, clinging to the faint hope that maybe, somehow, this was a mistake. Jackson looked me square in the eyes. "I'm sure, Dad. I saw them in the school parking lot." She was laughing, touching him. And then... He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching with anger. "Then she kissed him. Right there, in the open." The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as his words sank deeper. My own wife, with my son's teacher, in the middle of the parking lot. My hands clenched into fists as a wave of anger, hotter than anything I'd ever felt, surged through me. She didn't just betray me, she betrayed our son, our family. She'd flaunted it, practically parading it in front of Jackson, in front of everyone. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Jackson's eyes flashed. "I told her to leave, right then and there. I told her she wasn't coming back home, not after what she'd done. She tried to brush it off, said I didn't understand, but I didn't care. I told her to get out. She packed her things and left." It took everything in me to keep my voice steady. My 17-year-old son had confronted her, thrown her out while I'd been at home, oblivious to the storm brewing right under my nose. The guilt, the anger, the helplessness, they mixed together into something dark and consuming. "Jackson," I began, but my voice trailed off. What could I say? There were no words for this kind of betrayal. All I could do was sit there, stunned, as the weight of it settled over me. "We don't have to take this, Dad," Jackson said, his voice hard. "We don't have to let her do this to us and walk away like nothing happened. She's been lying to us both." I nodded, the truth of his words sinking in. She'd broken everything we'd built, shattered our family. And she'd done it right in front of him. "So what do we do?" I asked, the anger starting to edge into my voice. He looked at me, his jaw set. "We make her pay, Dad. We make her feel every ounce of the pain she's put us through." The anger I felt seemed to resonate in him. It was there, in his eyes, this fierce resolve. And for the first time since he walked in, I didn't feel alone. We were in this together, and we weren't going to let her get away with it. "All right," I said, feeling a sense of purpose start to replace the shock. "But we'll do this right. She broke our family, broke our trust, but we're going to make sure she knows just what she's done. So, that night, we sat down at the kitchen table, talking until dawn, planning out every step. This wouldn't be about revenge for revenge's sake. This was about showing her exactly what she threw away. It was about making her realize that every choice has consequences. We spent hours, hashing out every angle, every possibility, until we had a plan. By the time we were finished, the sunrise was casting a cold, pale light over the room. I looked at Jackson, his face set, and felt a surge of pride. He was standing up, taking charge, determined not to let this break us. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension and whispers of anger that we barely kept under control. Jackson and I went about our lives as usual, work, school, errands, but beneath the surface, we were seething. Every hour that ticked by only deepened my resolve to go through with our plan. And whenever I looked at Jackson, I could see that same resolve reflected in his eyes. We hadn't heard from Sarah since that night. Part of me wanted to believe she'd come back, knock on the door, maybe try to explain herself. But there was only silence, and I didn't know if that made things easier or worse. I'd had this life with her for so many years that the silence, the void she'd left, felt like a wound that refused to heal. I got through the first few days by staying focused, pouring myself into work and the plan Jackson and I had put together. We had decided that the first step was to expose her, to make sure that everyone who mattered knew exactly who she was and what she had done. And to do that, we needed proof, undeniable evidence of her betrayal. On a Thursday evening, I was working late when Jackson called me from his room. "Dad, come here. You need to see this." I found him sitting at his desk, his laptop open. He'd been digging, searching through any records he could find online. His jaw was tight, and his eyes burned with a sense of purpose I'd never seen before. "What is it?" I asked, leaning over to look at the screen. Jackson turned the laptop toward me, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "I found him. Mr. Raymond. He has social media accounts, and he posts everything about his life there. It looks like he has a habit of hanging out with his students, and their families." I stared at the screen. Mr. Raymond's profile was filled with pictures of him at school events, smiling with students, teachers, and parents. But Jackson was right. Something about the way he interacted with everyone seemed off. He was too close, too personal. In one photo, he had his arm draped around a student's shoulder in a way that struck me as odd. And in another, he was with a group of teachers, Sarah among them. They were laughing, his arm wrapped around her waist, a little too friendly for comfort. Jackson clicked on a video that Mr. Raymond had posted. It was a short clip from a school event, and there she was, Sarah, standing close beside him, laughing, touching his arm. I felt the anger flare up in me, hot and immediate. This was the man she'd chosen over us. This was the person she had risked everything for. "That's him," Jackson said, his voice low. "That's who she threw us away for." I clenched my fists, feeling the weight of my anger settle over me like a dark cloud. It was one thing to hear about her betrayal from Jackson, but seeing it, knowing this man was out there, living his life without a care, was too much to bear. I wanted him to know the pain he'd caused us. I wanted both of them to feel the same humiliation they had inflicted on us. "All right," I said, my voice steady but icy. "This is where we start." Jackson's eyes met mine, and I could see that he was ready. We talked about this, planned every detail, but now it was time to put it all in motion. The first step was simple: let her know we had the evidence. Jackson had pulled together every incriminating picture and video we could find, compiling them into a single file. It was damning enough that no one could deny what they were seeing. With a few clicks, he sent the file to Sarah's email, along with a single line that left no room for interpretation: "We know everything." I half expected her to show up at the house that night, but she didn't. Instead, Jackson's phone buzzed with a single message: "I can explain." He scoffed, showing me the text. "She thinks she can explain this?" he muttered, shaking his head. "She's lost it." The message only strengthened our resolve. She wanted to brush this off, maybe charm her way out of it, but we were beyond that now. She'd made her choices, and we were going to make sure she felt the weight of every one of them. The next step was even bolder. We needed Mr. Raymond's reputation to take a hit, so we started planting rumors. Jackson had a friend in his grade who ran a popular social media page for the school, a page everyone followed for updates, gossip, and school news. We slipped the story to him, feeding him just enough details to stir up questions. Within hours, students were talking, speculating, and by the next day, the whispers had reached the teachers, the parents, and eventually, the administration. Mr. Raymond started to get odd looks in the hallways. He noticed the students talking in hushed voices when he walked by, the way some teachers suddenly distanced themselves. He must have known something was brewing, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. All he knew was that his life was about to become very uncomfortable. On Friday afternoon, as Jackson and I sat at home, the next stage of our plan came into play. Jackson's phone buzzed with a message from one of his friends. "You won't believe it," the message read. "Mr. Raymond just got called into the principal's office. Word is it's bad." We exchanged a glance, a sense of vindication settling over us. It wasn't everything we wanted yet, but it was a start. Mr. Raymond was about to face the consequences of his choices, and this was only the beginning. By that evening, the school had issued a statement saying that Mr. Raymond had been placed on leave, pending an investigation into allegations of inappropriate conduct. The vague language only fueled the rumors, and before long, the entire town was buzzing with the scandal. That night, for the first time in days, I felt something close to satisfaction. Sarah and her lover were finally feeling the heat, and we were just getting started. By Saturday morning, the impact of our actions was spreading like wildfire. Every parent, student, and teacher in town was talking about Mr. Raymond. The vague statement from the school had only amplified the whispers, leaving everyone guessing, and the rumors, fueled by our carefully planted details, grew wilder by the hour. Jackson and I sat together at the kitchen table that morning, scrolling through social media and text messages, watching as everything unraveled exactly the way we'd hoped. One post on the school's page had comments piling up under it. "I heard it's about one of the parents. They say it happened on school grounds. I always thought something was off about him." The satisfaction in Jackson's face was unmistakable. He had taken the pain of his mother's betrayal and channeled it into something focused, something calculated. For a moment, I wondered if I should be worried about how easily he'd thrown himself into this revenge plan, but I couldn't deny that I felt the same satisfaction myself. This was justice. After what she'd done, she deserved to see everything she thought she had come crumbling down. Our phones buzzed almost at the same time, both lighting up with notifications from unknown numbers. I felt my pulse quicken, knowing it could only be one person. The first text was to me. "Derek, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but this is getting out of control." Jackson showed me his message too. It was nearly identical, only with a desperate, pleading tone. "Please, Jackson, I can explain. I made a mistake, but I'm still your mom. Don't do this." I looked at him, and he shrugged, unfazed. "She had her chance," he muttered, dismissing her message with a swipe. I couldn't argue with that. She'd had plenty of chances, and she'd thrown each one away the moment she decided to pursue her affair with his teacher. I felt a surge of anger, remembering all the times she'd acted like the perfect wife, laughing at family gatherings, making small talk at Jackson's school events, all while hiding her betrayal right under our noses. "Let's move to the next step," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. Jackson didn't hesitate. He knew the plan as well as I did. Now that Mr. Raymond's professional life was unraveling, it was time to cut off Sarah's support system. She had family nearby, her sister, Claire, and her parents, who lived about an hour away. They were a close-knit family, and I knew Sarah would try to run to them once she realized how alone she truly was. But they deserved to know the truth, too. I knew I'd lose them from my life for good, and I didn't care. If they could look at her the same way after everything she'd done, then I had no place with them. I called Claire first. She answered right away, her voice as cheerful as ever. Hey, Derek! What's up? Everything okay? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I need to tell you something about Sarah, I said, my voice cold and direct. A pause, then a slight edge in her voice. What's going on? She's been having an affair, I said bluntly. And not just with anyone, with Jackson's teacher, Mr. Raymond. Claire gasped. What? No, Derek, that can't be true. I mean, Sarah would never. She would, I interrupted, a hint of bitterness slipping into my voice. And she did. Jackson caught them in the act. He's the one who told me. This wasn't a one-time thing, Claire. She's been sneaking around with him for months, and she had the audacity to do it right where our son could see. I heard her breath hitch on the other end. Claire had always been protective of Jackson, treating him like her own child. I knew she wouldn't take this lightly. Oh my God! She whispered, her voice breaking. Does Mom and Dad know? Not yet, I said. But they will. I'm telling them because they need to hear it from me, not from her. Claire's voice hardened. I can't believe she would do this to you. To Jackson. She's going to regret this, Derek. I'll make sure of it. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. There was a resolve in her voice I hadn't expected, and I realized, in that moment, that Jackson and I weren't alone. Sarah was about to lose her family, the people she'd relied on her entire life. Her actions were about to cost her the very people she thought she could count on forever. After I hung up with Claire, I called her parents, reliving the same painful explanation. Her mother was devastated, her father furious. They didn't defend her. They listened, and when I was done, they simply thanked me for telling them the truth. Her father's last words to me were clear and cold. Don't let her near that boy. We'll handle her. When I hung up, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. Her bridges were burning, and there was no going back. The weekend passed in tense silence. Jackson and I barely spoke. There was nothing more to say. We'd set everything in motion, and all we had to do was wait for the fallout. By Sunday afternoon, I finally received a message from her. This one was desperate, laced with a panic I hadn't seen from her before. Derek, please. I'm begging you. I need to see Jackson. I need to explain myself. I know I've messed up, but I love him. I love both of you. I can't lose my family. I showed it to Jackson, who read it with a blank expression, then handed it back to me. Let her feel it, he said simply. I texted her back with a single line. You lost us the moment you decided we weren't enough. There was no response, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange, eerie peace settle over me. I knew we had hurt her, cut her off from everything she thought she could count on, but the betrayal she dealt us had left no room for mercy. That night, Jackson and I went out for dinner. It was quiet, just the two of us, but there was a sense of camaraderie, of understanding. We had come through this together, and while it hadn't been easy, we'd found our way out of the darkness she had left us in. As we finished our meal, Jackson looked across the table at me, a small, hesitant smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You know, Dad, maybe it's time you moved on too. I think you deserve that. I didn't expect to feel the warmth that spread through me at his words, but I did. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to let go, to start fresh. And as fate would have it, the very next week, I crossed paths with someone new. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, just as the dust from Sarah's departure was beginning to settle. I was at Jackson's high school, sitting in the bleachers for his track practice, watching him push himself with an intensity one hadn't seen before. The coach's whistle cut through the air, and the athletes launched into a sprint, their legs pounding against the track with all the force and determination you'd expect from a group of competitive teenagers. Sitting there, I felt proud of Jackson, of the way he was channeling everything he'd been through into something positive. He hadn't let his mother's betrayal break him. He'd taken it head on, and stood up for himself and for me in a way I hadn't known he was capable of. I wanted to believe we were starting to heal, that we were ready to put this all behind us. Then, just as practice was ending, a woman appeared by the bleachers, walking toward the track with purpose. She was tall and fit, dressed in athletic gear, with a no-nonsense expression that matched the whistle she wore around her neck. The physical education teacher, Jackson, had mentioned her before. Coach Taylor. She waved at the students as they passed, and when she turned to look at me, I felt the unexpected urge to sit up a little straighter. Her gaze was sharp, but there was a warmth there, a genuine friendliness in her smile that caught me off guard. "Mr. Carter, right?" she asked, crossing the few remaining feet between us. Her voice was low but confident, and it seemed to carry naturally in the space around us. "Yes," I replied, standing up, surprised she knew my name. "Call me Derek." "Derek," she repeated with a nod. "I'm Coach Taylor, Amy. Jackson talks about you sometimes. He's a great kid. You should be proud." I felt a surge of pride at her words. "Thank you. I am." She looked back toward the track, watching Jackson walk across the field with his teammates. "He's been pushing himself hard lately," she said, her voice softened, almost contemplative. "I don't know all the details, but it's clear he's been going through something. Just wanted to let you know I've been keeping an eye on him. If there's anything I should be aware of, feel free to let me know." I paused, trying to read her expression. It wasn't pity, it was genuine concern, the kind that comes from someone who's dedicated to her work and her students. I felt an odd urge to explain everything, to unload the story that had been weighing me down for weeks now. But I held back, not wanting to complicate things. "Thank you, Coach. I appreciate it," I said simply, giving her a small nod. She nodded in return, studying me for a moment as if she wanted to say more. And then she smiled, a warm, sincere smile that made me feel, for the first time in a while, that there might still be good people out there. "Jackson's got a lot of heart," she said, "and a father who clearly cares. He's going to be okay." We stood there for a beat longer, the silence comfortable, even welcome. I watched as she joined the students, calling out reminders for tomorrow's practice, her voice carrying a calm authority that the students clearly respected. There was something about her presence that lingered with me long after I left the track that day. Over the next few weeks, life slowly started to regain a sense of normalcy. Jackson and I fell into a rhythm that felt steady, even peaceful. Every now and then, Sarah would send a message, but Jackson and I both ignored them. Her pleas and apologies were empty, and I had no interest in letting her back into our lives, not after the way she'd betrayed us both. One day, Jackson came home from school with a grin that I hadn't seen in a long time. It was small, but it was genuine. He tossed his backpack onto the couch and grabbed an apple from the counter before looking over at me. "You know, Dad, Coach Taylor asked about you today," he said, a teasing glint in his eye. "Oh, yeah?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, though I could feel a smile starting to tug at my lips. "Yeah. She was wondering if you'd be interested in coming by practice again sometime. Said something about inviting you to one of the parent volunteer events," he said, clearly enjoying himself. "Guess she liked you." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help chuckling. "She's just being friendly. It's her job to care about her students and their families." "Uh-huh. Sure, Dad." Jackson took a bite of his apple, grinning around it. "She's nice, though. Probably one of the best teachers I've had, honestly." The thought lingered in my mind, a curiosity that I couldn't quite shake. Jackson was right, she was nice, and there was something about her that had left an impression. Over the next few days, the idea of seeing her again grew from a passing thought into something that felt almost inevitable. A few weeks later, I found myself at the next track meet, Jackson's suggestion playing over and over in my head. I hadn't planned on talking to her again, not specifically. But there she was, standing by the bleachers, clipboard in hand, calling out times to the students as they ran. When she caught sight of me, her face lit up with a genuine smile, and she walked over. "Derek! Back for another track meet, I see," she said with a playful tone, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "Couldn't stay away, I guess," I replied, feeling a bit more relaxed than I expected. "Jackson insisted I come along." She nodded, her eyes crinkling with amusement. He's a good kid. Determined, too. It's not every day you see someone bounce back from a rough patch the way he has. There was a brief pause, and then, almost as if testing the waters, she added, I get the feeling there's been a lot on your plate, too. The words hung in the air, and I realized that, somehow, she'd seen right through the walls I'd tried to keep up. Maybe it was her instinct as a teacher, or maybe just the way she seemed to care deeply about her students and their families. Whatever it was, I felt an urge to share a piece of my story with her. Yeah, let's just say things haven't been easy, I admitted, choosing my words carefully. But we're getting through it. One step at a time. She gave a small nod, her expression understanding. That's all you can do. And you're doing a good job. I can see it in the way Jackson's starting to lighten up. He's lucky to have a dad who's there for him. Something about her words touched a nerve, and I found myself smiling back, a genuine smile that felt strangely foreign yet welcome. We talked for a little longer, sharing stories about Jackson and his antics, the challenges of coaching teenagers, and a little about our own lives. When the meet wrapped up, I felt a strange sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. Amy had brought a lightness to my day, a reminder that there was still kindness, still connection out there, even in the aftermath of the darkest betrayal. As I drove home that evening, Jackson's comment echoed in my mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to move on, to open myself to the possibility of something new. And as I thought about Amy's laugh, her easy confidence, and the way she seemed to bring out the best in Jackson, I realized that, for the first time, I was ready to try. As the weeks passed, my thoughts drifted back to Amy more often than I cared to admit. She seemed to pop into my mind at the strangest times, when I was cooking dinner for Jackson, when I was heading to work, even in the quiet moments right before I fell asleep. I hadn't felt anything like this in years, a mix of curiosity and warmth that left me wondering if there was a chance to start over, to rebuild something I'd lost. And then one Saturday, Jackson came home from his morning run, breathless but grinning. He dropped his gym bag by the door and practically skipped into the kitchen. Guess what? He said, barely able to contain himself. I raised an eyebrow, setting down the coffee mug I'd been nursing. What's got you so excited? Amy, Coach Taylor, wants to know if you'd come to the team banquet next weekend, he said, his grin widening. She said it would be great if the parents could be there to celebrate the season, especially you. My stomach flipped. I tried to play it cool, but I could feel my pulse quicken. Oh, yeah? I said, feigning casual interest. A team banquet, huh? Jackson rolled his eyes, clearly seeing through me. Come on, Dad. You don't have to act like it's just another school event. She's nice, and I think, well, maybe you two could, hit it off. I laughed, shaking my head at his persistence. All right, I'll go, I conceded, holding up my hands. If it means that much to you, I'll be there. Jackson's grin turned triumphant. Good. You need this, Dad. And deep down, I knew he was right. I'd been stuck in a rut ever since Sarah's betrayal, weighed down by the bitterness of it all. It was time to break free, to try something new, even if it terrified me. The night of the banquet arrived faster than I expected. Jackson and I dressed up a little more than usual, which he found hilariously embarrassing, but I could tell he was as excited as I was. We pulled into the high school parking lot just as the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the field where Jackson had spent so many hours running. The banquet was held in the school's gym, which had been decorated with streamers and banners, and tables arranged in neat rows, each one set with a small centerpiece. It wasn't fancy by any means, but there was a cozy charm to it, a feeling of community that I hadn't realized I missed. As we entered, I spotted Amy near the front, talking to a few parents and laughing easily. She looked up, caught sight of us, and her face lit up. She waved, excused herself, and walked over, a warm smile on her face. Derek! Jackson! So glad you could make it, she said, her eyes bright. Thanks for inviting us, I replied, trying to ignore the way my stomach flipped at the sight of her. She turned to Jackson, giving him a proud nod. "You've had a great season, Jackson. You should be proud." Jackson beamed. "Thanks, Coach. You've been great too. Couldn't have done it without you." As we chatted, the buzz of conversation around us filled the gym. Parents, teachers, and students mingled, sharing laughs and stories from the season. Amy introduced me to a few other parents, and before I knew it, the three of us had fallen into an easy conversation, laughing about Jackson's antics during practices, the chaos of school events, and the joys and struggles of parenting teenagers. After dinner, Amy invited me to step outside for a breather, a chance to escape the noise for a moment. We stood in the cool evening air, looking out over the quiet field. The distant stadium lights cast a soft glow over the grass, and for a moment, we just enjoyed the silence. "You know," Amy began, breaking the quiet, "I can tell Jackson looks up to you. It's clear he respects you a lot." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't really considered how much Jackson had taken on in the wake of everything with Sarah, but hearing it from someone else made me realize just how strong he'd been. "Thanks," I said, feeling a pang of pride mixed with guilt. "He's been through a lot, more than any kid his age should have to deal with. But he's resilient. He's stronger than I'll ever be." Amy nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I've seen kids go through tough things, but Jackson, he has a kind of inner strength you don't see often. He's a lot like you." I glanced at her, surprised by her words. There was something comforting in the way she looked at me, like she understood things most people wouldn't even notice. I felt the urge to open up, to let her in, and before I knew it, the words were spilling out. "My wife. Jackson's mom, she left us," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She betrayed us both. And he was the one who found out, who confronted her. He was the one who had the strength to push her out when I couldn't." Amy's eyes softened, filled with a sympathy that didn't feel like pity. "I'm so sorry, Derek. I can't imagine how hard that must have been." "It was tough," I said, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "But I think maybe we're finally ready to move on." Amy placed a gentle hand on my arm, her touch warm and steady. "Moving on isn't easy, but sometimes it's the only way to find peace. And if it means anything, I think you're both doing an amazing job. Jackson's lucky to have you." I met her gaze, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through me. "Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate that." We stood there for a while, just taking in the stillness, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of calm, of something new blossoming beneath the weight of everything I'd been through. It was a strange, fragile feeling, but it was real, and I wanted to hold on to it. In the weeks that followed, Amy and I began seeing each other more often. It started with casual conversations after practice, a quick coffee here and there, but it soon became something more. She was easy to talk to, understanding, and she had this warmth that seemed to melt away the walls I'd built around myself. With her, there were no pretenses, no judgments. She accepted me and Jackson exactly as we were. For the first time since Sarah had left, I felt a sense of hope, a possibility of starting fresh. Jackson noticed, too. He'd throw in the occasional teasing remark, grinning whenever he saw us talking, but I could tell he was genuinely happy to see me moving on. One Saturday, as Jackson and I were having breakfast, he looked up from his cereal with a sly grin. "So, are you going to make it official with Coach Taylor, or are you just going to keep pretending you're just friends?" he asked, his tone light but curious. I chuckled, shaking my head. "Is it that obvious?" Jackson rolled his eyes. "Dad, I may be 17, but I'm not blind. She's good for you. I like her." I couldn't help but smile, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "You really think so?" He nodded, his gaze serious for a moment. "Yeah, I do. She's kind, and she cares about you. That's all that matters." His words stayed with me, and that afternoon, I called Amy and invited her out to dinner. A real date, no hiding, no excuses. It was time to move forward, to open myself up to the possibility of happiness again. That night, as we sat across from each other, laughing over dinner, sharing stories, I realized that I was finally ready to let go of the past. Amy wasn't just a friend, she was someone who had walked into my life when I needed her most, someone who showed me that there was still love, still kindness, still a future worth fighting for. And as we drove home, I looked over at her, a smile spreading across my face. I didn't know where this would go, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I'd found my way out of the darkness. The weeks that followed felt like a dream I hadn't dared to imagine. Amy and I spent more time together, not just on dates but in the simple, everyday moments that felt real and grounding. We'd take Jackson and some of his friends out for pizza, or we'd go for long walks in the evening, just talking about everything and nothing. With Amy, there was no pressure, no need to put on a brave face. For the first time since Sarah's betrayal, I felt like I could breathe. Jackson, of course, took full advantage of my new relationship. He loved to tease me, making side comments and giving Amy exaggerated winks whenever we were together. And the truth was, I didn't mind it. Seeing him smile, seeing him genuinely happy after all he'd been through, it was worth every awkward moment. One evening, as Jackson and I were cleaning up after dinner, he looked over at me with a curious expression. "So, Dad," he began, a mischievous smile creeping onto his face. "Have you thought about, asking Amy to be your girlfriend?" I laughed, tossing a dish towel over my shoulder. "You're awfully invested in this, aren't you?" He shrugged, unbothered. "I just think she makes you happy, that's all. And you deserve that." His words caught me off guard, leaving a lump in my throat. I hadn't realized how much he'd been paying attention, how much he cared about seeing me move on. It was like he was giving me permission to finally let go of everything Sarah had done to us. "Well," I said, clearing my throat, "we'll see where things go. But yeah, I think you're right." That Friday night, I took Jackson's advice to heart. I invited Amy over for a quiet dinner, just the two of us. I had planned to keep things casual, but there was a feeling in the air, an excitement that made me want to make it special. I even cooked, something I hadn't done in a while, and when she arrived, the smell of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen, giving the room a warm, inviting feel. Amy's eyes lit up as she stepped in, taking in the scene. "Well, look at this," she teased, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't know you were a chef." I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but I could feel my cheeks reddening. "Every now and then," I said with a grin. "I figured you deserved something a little nicer than takeout." We laughed, falling into the comfortable rhythm we'd developed, and as we ate, I felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months lifting. It was as if, in that moment, it was just us, two people who had found each other when we needed it most. After dinner, we moved to the couch, and the conversation turned deeper. We talked about our families, our past, our fears. I found myself opening up about Sarah in a way I hadn't before, telling her things I hadn't even told Jackson. "It's not just the cheating," I said quietly, staring at my hands. "It's the trust. She broke something I thought was unbreakable. I keep wondering if I'll ever be able to trust like that again." Amy reached out, her hand resting gently on mine. "I get it, Derek. And I can't say it'll be easy. But you don't have to rush it. Trust takes time." Her words were gentle, reassuring, and they made me feel something I hadn't expected: hope. Maybe, with her, I could start to rebuild that trust, one step at a time. As the evening went on, the distance between us faded, and before I knew it, we were close, our hands intertwined. I looked into her eyes, seeing the warmth and understanding there, and in that moment, I felt a pull that was undeniable. I leaned in, and our lips met, soft and tentative, but filled with the promise of something more. When we pulled back, her smile was radiant, and for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The days turned into weeks, and Amy became a part of our lives in a way I hadn't anticipated. She was there for the big moments and the small ones, Jackson's track meets, our weekend hikes, even simple family dinners. She fit into our lives seamlessly, like she'd always belonged there. And Jackson? He was thrilled. His smile was brighter, his laughter more frequent. He had a new lightness about him, as if seeing me happy had lifted a weight off his own shoulders. He'd even started teasing me about my girlfriend, but there was pride in his eyes whenever he did. We were finally finding our rhythm again, a new version of our family that felt just as real, just as strong. One Saturday morning, as Amy and I were having coffee on the back porch, she turned to me, her expression serious. "Derek," she said, her voice soft, "there's something I need to tell you." I felt a flicker of unease but kept my tone light. "What's up?" She took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "I got a call from the school yesterday. It's about Sarah." The mention of her name was like a splash of cold water. I hadn't heard from Sarah in weeks, and I'd done my best to push her out of my mind. But now, hearing her name again, I felt the old anger and hurt rise up, mingling with curiosity and apprehension. "What about her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Amy looked at me, her eyes filled with compassion. "Apparently, she's been trying to contact Mr. Raymond, asking him for help in clearing her name. But it's not just that. She's also been asking about Jackson, trying to get messages to him through other teachers." I felt a surge of anger, my fists clenching at the thought of her trying to worm her way back into our lives. She had already done enough damage, and now she wanted to drag Jackson back into her mess? I'd be damned if I let that happen. "She doesn't get to come back into his life like this," I said, my voice hard. "Not after what she did." Amy placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "I know, Derek. And Jackson knows that too. But I thought you should be aware, in case she tries anything more drastic." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of comfort in her presence. She was here, standing by me, ready to support me through whatever Sarah threw our way. And somehow, that made it all a little easier to bear. That evening, I sat down with Jackson and told him what Amy had shared with me. He listened, his expression guarded, but I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. After I finished, he sat in silence for a moment, processing everything. "So, she thinks she can just walk back into my life?" he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "After everything she did?" I placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, son. She doesn't get to do that. Not after the way she hurt us." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a determination that made me proud. "Then let her try. I'm not going back. Not after everything she put us through." We sat in silence for a while, and I felt a wave of pride wash over me. Jackson was stronger than I'd ever imagined, standing firm in the face of his mother's manipulations. He had grown into a young man who wouldn't be swayed by her lies, and I knew that, no matter what happened, we would be okay. And with Amy by our side, I felt more certain than ever that we could face whatever came next. We had each other, and that was enough. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's attempts to contact Jackson grew more sporadic, as if she was slowly realizing that her efforts were in vain. Eventually, the messages stopped altogether, and life returned to the steady rhythm we'd come to know. Amy continued to be a part of our lives, not just as my partner but as a friend to Jackson, someone he could rely on and look up to. With her around, our family felt whole again, different but stronger. One evening, as the three of us sat around the dinner table, laughing and sharing stories, I looked at Jackson and Amy, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. This was our life now, imperfect, maybe, but real and honest, built on the trust and love we'd forged through the hardest times. I glanced at Amy, who gave me a knowing smile, and I knew that, together, we could face whatever came our way. Months passed, and as spring turned to summer, the wounds Sarah had left behind seemed to finally be healing. Jackson thrived, his laughter filling the house again. Amy was now woven into our lives in ways I hadn't thought possible, there in the quiet moments, the family meals, even the occasional Sunday morning when she joined us for breakfast, laughing as Jackson teased her about her sports trivia or challenged her to a sprint he could never win. It was a normal Saturday afternoon when Jackson burst through the door, out of breath and flushed from his run. But this time, there was something different in his expression. He looked shaken, his usual light-heartedness replaced by a grim determination. "Dad," he said, catching his breath, You're not going to believe who I just ran into. I set down my coffee, the familiarity of his expression making my heart sink. What happened? Mom, he said, his voice steady but filled with a mix of anger and hurt. She was at the park. I was running, and suddenly, there she was. She tried to talk to me, Dad. She said she missed me and wanted to fix things. My stomach twisted at his words. After all this time, after all the pain she'd caused, she had the audacity to ambush him, trying to worm her way back into his life. I felt the anger surge up in me, but I held back, knowing Jackson needed my calm more than my rage. What did you do? I asked, keeping my voice steady. He clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. I told her she lost that chance when she betrayed us, Dad. I told her we're fine without her and that I didn't want anything to do with her. I walked away, but she looked so desperate. She kept calling after me, saying she was sorry. I crossed the room and pulled him into a hug, feeling the tension radiating off him. I'm so proud of you, Jackson. You don't owe her anything. You've come so far, and you don't need her to move forward. He nodded against my shoulder, his breathing slowly evening out. I know, Dad. I can't believe she'd think it was that easy, like we could just forget what she did. She probably does, I said, keeping my tone calm. But that's her problem, not ours. You handled it exactly the way you needed to. After a moment, he pulled back, giving me a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Dad. As he headed upstairs, I felt a mixture of pride and frustration. I wanted to protect Jackson from any more of her attempts to worm her way back into his life, to shield him from the hurt she'd caused. But this was part of the reality we had to face now, a new chapter where we protected ourselves, kept our boundaries firm, and moved forward with the family we were building, free from her manipulations. A few days later, I was at work when I received a call from an unknown number. At first, I considered ignoring it, but something compelled me to pick up. Hello? There was a pause, then a voice I hadn't expected to hear. Derek, it's Sarah. I stiffened, feeling the anger bubble up immediately. What do you want, Sarah? She hesitated, then sighed, her voice trembling. Please, just hear me out. I know I have no right to ask for anything after what I did. I know I hurt you and Jackson. But I've realized my mistakes, Derek. I want to fix things. I want to be part of Jackson's life again. Her words, filled with a desperation that almost sounded sincere, might have moved me once. But now, they only reminded me of the betrayal and the lies, the damage she had done to our family. You want to be part of his life? I repeated, my voice icy. Sarah, you lost that chance the moment you decided we weren't enough for you. Jackson has moved on, and so have I. We're doing fine without you. But Derek, please, she started, her voice breaking. No, I cut her off firmly. You made your choice. Jackson and I deserve to move on without having to relive your mistakes. I don't want you contacting us again. I could hear her stifled sob on the other end, but I forced myself to stay strong. This was about protecting the life Jackson and I had rebuilt, the peace we'd found. Goodbye, Sarah, I said, ending the call before she could respond. As I set the phone down, I felt a sense of finality, like I closed the last door on a chapter I'd spent too long trapped in. Sarah was part of our past, but that's where she would stay. That evening, as I sat down with Jackson and Amy for dinner, I felt a peace that had eluded me for far too long. The tension that had been gnawing at me ever since Sarah's betrayal had faded, replaced by a quiet certainty that this life with Jackson and Amy, was what mattered now. Amy looked across the table, her gaze warm. You seem lighter tonight, she said with a soft smile. I nodded, reaching across to squeeze her hand. I think I finally am. Jackson watched us, a proud smile spreading across his face. Good, he said, raising his glass of soda. Here's to moving on. We clinked glasses, laughing and settling into the easy conversation that had come to define our new life. As the evening wore on, I felt a sense of gratitude for this second chance, this family we had found through the chaos and hurt. Later that night, As Amy and I sat on the porch, watching the stars, she leaned her head on my shoulder. I'm proud of you, Derek. I know how hard it is to let go of something that hurt you so deeply. But you did it. You're stronger than you realize. I wrapped an arm around her, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. I couldn't have done it without you. You helped me see that there's still good out there, still people worth trusting. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a gentle understanding. We're in this together, Derek. Whatever comes our way, we'll face it side by side. I leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. And as we sat there, the night quiet around us, I knew that this was where I was meant to be. We had found our way through the darkest moments, and now, finally, we were free to build a life defined by love, trust, and the strength we had found in each other. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of peace. It was like I had finally broken free from the weight of everything Sarah had done, and for the first time in years, I was able to start thinking about the future with real hope. I knew the past would always be part of our story, but now, it felt like a chapter that was closed. And with Amy by my side, I was ready to see where life would take us next. Jackson had his final track meet of the season that Saturday, and Amy joined us, cheering louder than anyone in the stands. It was a beautiful day, the kind that reminded me how lucky I was to have the life I did. When Jackson crossed the finish line, he looked up at us, his face flushed with pride, and raised his arms in victory. Amy and I exchanged a look, both of us beaming. After the meet, we went out for ice cream, a tradition Jackson and I had kept since he was little. This time, with Amy there, it felt even better, more complete. As we sat at a picnic table, laughing and sharing stories, I realized this was the life I'd been waiting for. When we got back home, Jackson disappeared to his room, exhausted from the day, while Amy and I stayed out on the back porch, watching the stars slowly appear in the sky. The quiet was soothing, and as I held her hand, I felt a surge of gratitude for everything she'd brought into our lives. Amy leaned her head on my shoulder. I don't think I've ever seen you and Jackson this happy, she said softly. I looked down at her, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. It's because of you, Amy. You came into our lives right when we needed someone most. She smiled, reaching up to touch my cheek. You two had it in you all along. I just gave you a little push. We sat there, wrapped in the comfort of each other's presence, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. We'd come through the fire stronger, and now, we had the chance to build something new, something real. As the summer rolled on, life continued to settle into a calm, steady rhythm. Amy became more and more a part of our lives, and Jackson's confidence grew with each passing day. His smile came more easily, his laughter filled the house, and he'd even started talking about his plans for college, something that had felt like a distant dream just months ago. One evening, as Jackson and I were cleaning up after dinner, he looked over at me with a serious expression. Dad, he began, setting down his dish towel. Are you happy with Amy? The question caught me off guard, but I nodded without hesitation. Yeah, I am. She's amazing. Jackson smiled, a softness in his eyes. I'm glad, Dad. You deserve to be happy, and she's been good for both of us. I reached out, ruffling his hair. I think you deserve to be happy too. We both do. He nodded, and for a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of our shared journey settling over us. We'd been through so much together, and now, it felt like we were finally coming out the other side, stronger and closer than ever. The next few weeks passed in a blissful routine. Amy and I spent more time together, sharing the small, quiet moments that made life feel whole again. And as Jackson prepared for his senior year, I felt a sense of pride and relief. We'd survived, and we were stronger for it. But there was still one last thing I wanted to do, one final step to close the door on the past and embrace the future with Amy fully. One evening, after a family dinner, I took Amy's hand and led her out onto the porch, the cool night air wrapping around us. The stars were out, and the soft glow of the porch light cast a warm halo over her face. Amy, I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. You came into my life at a time when I didn't think I'd be able to trust again. You helped me heal, showed me that there's still good in this world, and you brought light into my life and Jackson's. She looked at me, her eyes shining, and squeezed my hand. Derek, you and Jackson are everything to me. I feel so lucky to have found you both. I took a deep breath, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small box. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I want you by my side. Will you move in with us, officially? Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, laughing softly. Yes, Derek. I would love that. We embraced, and I felt a rush of joy and gratitude. The past was behind us, and we were ready to build a life together, a real, honest life, free from the shadows of betrayal. And as we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew this was the start of something beautiful. Amy moved in a few weeks later, and it felt like the missing piece of our lives finally clicked into place. Jackson was thrilled, of course. He helped Amy unpack, rearrange the kitchen to be more efficient, and even suggested they take over cooking some nights. The house was filled with laughter and warmth, a far cry from the silence that had once weighed it down. The three of us quickly settled into a new rhythm. Amy brought a lightness to our days that Jackson and I hadn't known we needed. Mornings became a cheerful scramble as she and Jackson debated over breakfast choices and shared inside jokes. Evenings turned into family game nights or long talks on the back porch, where we'd share stories, plans, and dreams for the future. One evening, as we were cleaning up after a late dinner, Jackson turned to us with a mischievous grin. So, have you two thought about making this, official? I looked at Amy, who laughed, her eyes bright with amusement. What are you saying, Jackson? Are you trying to marry me off to your dad? She teased. Jackson shrugged, a playful glint in his eye. Hey, I'm just saying, you two seem like a perfect match. And it would be kind of nice to have the whole family thing, you know? The suggestion hung in the air, leaving both Amy and me silent for a moment. We never talked about marriage, not yet. But as I looked at her, I realized that it felt right. Amy was already part of our family, and the thought of building a future together felt as natural as breathing. Well, I said slowly, glancing at Amy. Maybe one day. If she'd have me. Amy smiled, a blush rising in her cheeks. I think I'd be pretty lucky, she replied softly, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. Jackson clapped his hands together, a triumphant grin on his face. All right, I'm holding you both to it. Don't keep me waiting too long. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness. Jackson was in his senior year, and he poured himself into his studies and his track team. Amy was there for every meet, cheering louder than anyone else, and when Jackson brought home his first-place medal, she practically tackled him with pride. It was moments like these that reminded me just how far we'd come, how much we'd overcome to reach this point. One evening, after Jackson had gone to bed, Amy and I were sitting out on the porch, enjoying the cool autumn air. She rested her head on my shoulder, her hand warm in mine. Do you ever think about how different things would have been if we hadn't found each other? She asked softly. I thought back to the dark months after Sarah's betrayal, the anger and hurt that had weighed me down like an anchor. If Amy hadn't come into our lives, I wasn't sure I'd ever have found the strength to move on. Every day, I replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You saved me, Amy. You showed me there's still good, still people worth trusting. She smiled, her eyes full of warmth. And you gave me a family I didn't know I was looking for. You and Jackson, you're everything to me. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us lost in the simple joy of being together. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. This was our life now, a life built on trust, love, and the strength we'd found in each other. And as I looked out over the quiet yard, the stars twinkling above, I knew this was exactly where I was meant to be. As winter settled in, our new life together felt as strong and steady as ever. The holidays were approaching, and for the first time, Jackson and I looked forward to celebrating with someone who truly felt like family. Amy brought her warmth and festive spirit to every corner of our home. She hung twinkling lights around the porch, decorated the fireplace with stockings, and even insisted we go out as a family to pick the perfect Christmas tree. Jackson was in high spirits, more animated than I'd seen him in years. It was his last holiday season at home before heading off to college, and we wanted to make it special. One evening, after decorating the tree with him and Amy, we sat together with mugs of hot cocoa, the room bathed in the soft glow of Christmas lights. "So," Jackson began, leaning forward with a gleam in his eye, "are you two finally going to make it official?" Amy and I exchanged an amused glance, and I felt a surge of warmth at Jackson's eagerness. I looked over at her, and she squeezed my hand, her eyes sparkling. "Well," I said, setting down my mug and taking a deep breath, "I was actually planning to ask her something important. But I wanted you here for it too." Jackson's face lit up, and he sat up straighter, his excitement barely contained. Amy raised an eyebrow, her gaze flicking between us, a hint of confusion in her eyes. "Amy," I began, turning to face her fully, "meeting you was like finding something I didn't even realize I'd lost. You've brought light into our lives, a kind of happiness I never thought we'd find again. You've been there for Jackson, for me, and I can't imagine our lives without you." Her eyes softened, and her lips curved into a smile, her hand tightening in mine. "So," I continued, my voice growing softer, "will you marry me?" Amy's eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked stunned. But then she broke into a smile, tears welling up as she nodded. "Yes, Derek. 1,000,000 times yes." Jackson let out a whoop, pumping his fist in the air. "Finally! Took you too long enough." We laughed, caught up in the joy of the moment, and I wrapped my arms around Amy, pulling her close. It felt surreal, standing there with her and Jackson, knowing that we'd come through the darkest days to find this, the family we'd all been searching for. The weeks that followed were filled with wedding planning, laughter, and a sense of anticipation. We kept it simple, opting for an intimate ceremony in the spring, just family and a few close friends. Jackson helped plan, giving input on everything from the location to the food. He even insisted on writing a speech, although he kept the details tightly under wraps, claiming he wanted it to be a surprise. The wedding day arrived, a sunny spring morning with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers. Amy looked stunning, her face radiant as she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on mine. Jackson stood by my side as my best man, his smile wide and proud. As we exchanged vows, I felt a sense of gratitude that I couldn't put into words. Amy wasn't just the woman I loved, she was my partner, the person who had helped me rebuild a life I thought was shattered beyond repair. And as I looked at Jackson, standing there beside me, I felt a fierce pride for the young man he'd become. We'd been through hell and back, but together, we'd come out stronger. When it was Jackson's turn to speak, he cleared his throat, glancing between me and Amy, a soft smile on his face. "I just want to say thank you," he began, his voice steady and sincere. "To both of you. Dad, you taught me what it means to be strong, to keep going even when life throws things at you that feel impossible to handle. And Amy, you showed us that there's still good out there, that people can come into our lives and make them better in ways we didn't even know we needed." He paused, his gaze lingering on us, his voice filled with emotion. "I know we're not a traditional family, but we're a family all the same. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." The crowd let out a collective sigh, and I felt a lump in my throat as I pulled Jackson into a hug, unable to hold back the surge of love and pride I felt for him. As the sun set on our wedding day, I stood with Amy and Jackson, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. The day had been perfect, filled with laughter, love, and the feeling of hope for the future. I wrapped my arm around Amy, pulling her close as Jackson stood on my other side, his hand resting on my shoulder. "We did it," I murmured, a smile spreading across my face. Amy looked up at me, her eyes filled with warmth. "We did. And this is just the beginning." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle over me. This was just the start of a new chapter, a chapter defined not by betrayal or loss, but by love, resilience, and the family we had built together. And as we stood there, watching the last light fade, I knew that, no matter what came our way, we would face it together. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.